Usually, when we look back at a historical event or, try to understand how a massive political system operates, there's this baseline expectation of clarity.
Right, like a clean narrative.
Yeah, exactly. You open a textbook, you look at the timeline, and it draws this clean, straight line from cause to effect.
Cause and effect, yeah.
A historian points to the map and says, this nation invaded that nation, which caused this treaty, which, led to this era. It's linear.
It's very neat and tidy.
Right. It's binary, allied or axis,
So,
east or west. But then you start reading into the world of covert operations, shadow governments, esoteric power structures, and suddenly, well, that comforting textbook map just totally dissolved.
completely vanishes.
The ink goes invisible. And the landscape we are looking at today with you, our listener, isn't just murky. It's a complete violent inversion of literally everything we are taught to accept about global power.
It really is. I mean,
Yeah.
it shatters that comforting illusion of linear history.
Yeah.
We naturally, gravitate toward narratives with visible mechanisms.
Right. We want the good guys and bad guys to wear easily identifiable uniforms.
Exactly. But the stack of sources we are analyzing for this deep dive today, it forces us to look at a reality where the uniforms are entirely fake.
Completely fabricated.
Yeah, and the most trusted institutions on Earth are allegedly functioning as, like, camouflage for something deeply, deeply sinister.
So to put it bluntly, today's deep dive is going to take us into some of the most uncomfortable territory we have ever covered.
Oh, without a doubt.
We are unpacking a sprawling, intensely controversial alternate history of global power dynamics. And this is drawn from a massive stack of alternative historical analyses, declassified intelligence documents, and, frankly, some incredibly harrowing whistleblower testimonies.
It's really tough stuff to get through.
Yeah, very tough. And the core narrative running through all these texts, I mean, it's staggering. The overarching claim is that the Vatican, and by that, these authors mean the Pope, the Holy See, the Jesuit order, the highest echelons of Freemasonry, the Knights of Malta, the bishops, the whole Roman Catholic hierarchy.
The entire apparatus.
Right. They claim it operates not as a Christian religious institution, but as a Babylonic Luciferian entity.
And that theological subversion, I mean, that's only the foundational layer of the claim.
Which is wild on its own.
It is. But the architectural claim of these sources is that this entity actually created and currently controls the entire global intelligence apparatus.
Let that sink in for a second.
Right. We are talking about the CIA in the United States, MI6 in the UK, Israel's Mossad, the KGB in Russia.
And it doesn't stop there.
No, the text list.
Yeah.
The CSIS and CSE in Canada, the SVR and FSB in Russia, MI5, the MSS in China, Pakistan's ISI, the RGB, the CNI in Spain, essentially every major alphabet agency across the globe.
Every single one. And the ultimate purpose of this massive intelligence octopus, this is where the material just gets exceptionally dark.
Yeah, this is the core of it.
The sources allege that these agencies were not built primarily for national defense or geopolitical espionage, but to serve as a heavily armed, legally immune procurement network for systemic child trafficking and abuse.
So before we go a single step further into how these authors construct that argument, we need to draw a very firm line in the sand regarding our role here today.
Absolutely. We have to make this clear.
The material we are exploring today contains extreme, deeply disturbing, and highly politically charged claims.
Yeah, it touches on sensitive topics and explicitly implicates a massive array of prominent figures across the entire political spectrum. Left-wing, right-wing, secular, religious, you name it.
Everyone is in the crosshairs here. So we must make it absolutely unequivocally clear to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of these viewpoints.
No, not at all. We are not saying these claims are the objective truth.
Our role today is strictly as impartial guides. We are here to read the map that these authors have drawn, to unpack the ideas exactly as they are written in the original source material.
Right. Our goal is to help you understand the mechanics of the narrative being presented, regardless of how shocking or paradigm-breaking it is. We're just reporting on the text, dissecting their logic, and exploring how they connect these seemingly disparate dots.
Exactly. So with that essential context in place, we can begin to look at the framework the authors used to tie all this together.
Let's do it.
They take these seemingly disconnected historical milestones, the ideological freeze of the Cold War, the bureaucratic birth of the CIA, and thousands of international missing persons cases, and they weave them to a unified theory.
And they call this theory the devil's simulation.
The devil's simulation, yeah.
That phrase, I mean, it kept jumping off the page at me while I was reading through the stack.
It's very evocative.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian sci-fi novel. But the authors use it to describe a very tangible, mechanical system of engineered corruption.
Tangible is the right word. They view it as a machine.
Right. The way I understood it, the texts are describing a hidden power structure that creates perpetual crises. Like, they engineer wars, manufacture financial collapses, flood streets with narcotics.
All of it.
And all to keep the global populace in a state of constant, terrified exhaustion, just herding them into a sort of willing servitude.
That is the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
I mean, the logic presented in the sources is that if a population is comfortable and secure, they have the energy to question authority.
Sure, you have time to think.
Right. But if you trap them in a simulation of perpetual existential threat, like a looming nuclear holocaust or a sudden economic depression or a cultural breakdown, well, they will gladly hand over their civil liberties.
They'll give up their personal sovereignty to anyone promising safety.
Exactly. And the architect of this grand simulation, according to these texts, sits in Rome.
Rome. Okay, so to grasp how the Vatican could allegedly run a global trafficking network through intelligence agencies, we have to deeply analyze who these sources claim is actually sitting at the control panel.
We have to look at the structure.
Right, because the fundamental premise of these texts is that the Roman Catholic Church, as we understand it, is a facade.
It's a total front.
The authors argue that the hierarchy of the Church modeled its power structure not on the teachings of the New Testament, but on ancient Babylonian priesthoods.
Which is a huge claim.
It is a massive philosophical leap. I really want to pause on this. What do the texts actually mean when they call the Vatican Babylonic or Luciferian? I mean, they aren't just throwing those words around as generic insults, are they?
No, not at all. They are using them in a very specific structural sense.
Okay, break that down for us.
When the sources describe the institution as Babylonic, they're referring to a syncretic system of power. So in ancient Babylon, the priesthood functioned as the ultimate gatekeepers of both spiritual salvation and physical survival.
Right, they held all the cards.
Exactly. They controlled the esoteric mysteries, the secret knowledge, basically while presenting a simplified, heavily ritualized religion to the masses just to keep them compliant.
So a two-tiered system.
Yes. And the authors, like David Icke and others in our stack, they argue that the Vatican hierarchy adopted this exact dual-layered system.
Wow.
They present Christian aesthetics, charity, and theology to the billions of believers, but the texts explicitly claim that the inner core of the hierarchy, and I quote, does not even believe in Christianity.
See, that makes me think of a biological phenomenon, like a parasitic cordyceps fungus.
Oh, like the ones that infect insects.
Yeah, exactly. You know, from the outside, the ant looks like an ant, it walks like an ant. But internally, its entire nervous system has been hijacked and hollowed out by a completely different organism that's just driving it for its own purposes.
That is a remarkably accurate way to visualize the claim.
It's wearing the skin of the religion.
Yes. The host organism provides the perfect camouflage. And inside that shell, the sources detail a very rigid, autocratic hierarchy.
Okay, so let's look at that inner hierarchy. Who is actually running the show inside the ant, so to speak?
Well, at the absolute pinnacle, you have the Pope. But the texts are quick to remind us that the Pope is not a prime minister or a president. He is a sovereign monarch.
Right, he's the head of state of Vatican City.
Exactly. He possesses absolute, infallible authority within that structure, unconstrained by a democratic parliament or a system of checks and balances.
No Supreme Court can overrule him.
Exactly. However, the narrative suggests that while the Pope is the autocratic ruler, the true operational militant power, the vanguard driving the simulation is the Society of Jesus.
The Jesuits. Man, if there is one word that echoes through this entire stack of material more than any other, it's the Jesuits.
They are central to the whole thesis.
Founded by Ignatius de Loyola in the 16th century. I mean, in standard history, we know them for running prestigious universities, right?
Right, Georgetown, Boston College.
Yeah, or for their intense intellectual rigor and their global missionary work. But these authors paint a drastically different picture.
Oh, completely different. The alternate history presented here frames the Jesuits as the Vatican's private intelligence agency and military command.
A military command hiding in plain sight.
Yes. They are purportedly led by a figure historically referred to as the Black Pope.
The Black Pope.
Right, a title derived both from his traditional black clerical attire and his alleged shadow authority that operates behind the scenes of the White Pope.
The public face versus the shadow commander.
Exactly. According to the texts, the Jesuits are the strategists. They are described as specializing in whatever methods are required to maintain and expand the devil's simulation.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning whether that involves geopolitical maneuvering, orchestrating wars, coordinating assassinations, or, managing organized crime syndicates.
Okay, I found myself struggling to visualize how this command structure actually interfaces with the modern secular world.
It's complex, for sure.
Because if the Vatican is the overarching sovereign state and the Jesuits are the operational commanders, where do the other groups mentioned in the texts fit in? Because the material is absolutely overflowing with references to the Knights of Malta and the Freemasons.
Right, the secret societies.
Yeah. In popular culture, we tend to think of Freemasons as guys in aprons doing charity work, or the Knights of Malta as some archaic aristocratic club.
The sources vehemently reject that benign interpretation.
I figured. What do they say they actually are?
They frame these secret societies as the vital connective tissue between the religious front and the secular spheres of military, intelligence, and high finance.
Connective tissue, okay.
Let's look at the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the SMOM. Beneath the Jesuit command structure, the Knights of Malta function as the diplomatic and logistical bridge.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
The texts argue that you don't use a priest in a collar to run a black market banking operation or direct a foreign intelligence desk.
Right, that would be too obvious.
Exactly. You use a Knight of Malta. Similarly, they argue that while lower-level Freemasonry might appear to be a secular, Protestant-leaning fraternity, its highest esoteric levels are fundamentally subservient to the Jesuit general.
So it's like a Matryoshka doll.
Yes.
The structure is highly compartmentalized. It's designed so that the left hand never truly knows who is guiding the right hand.
That's the brilliance of it, according to the texts.
So the guy at the local Masonic lodge thinks he's just part of a community network.
Right. Paying his dues, going to dinners.
Yeah, completely unaware that, according to this narrative, the apex of his organization ties directly back to a Jesuit command structure in Rome.
Compartmentalization is the key to the entire theory. The authors paint a picture of a malignant foreign sovereign entity whose ultimate goal isn't spiritual salvation, but a return to what they term the Dark Ages.
The Dark Ages.
Yeah, a societal structure where a papal Caesar exercises absolute temporal and political power over all nations, systematically crushing any genuine political or religious freedom.
Okay, if we accept the author's premise for a moment, that this massive, multi-layered command structure exists, it forces a massive logistical question.
The muscle.
Yes, the muscle. How does a sovereign entity with a footprint of a little over 100 acres inside Rome actually enforce its will on a global scale?
Right, they don't have an army.
They don't have a traditional standing army at all. I mean, the Swiss Guard, with their halberds and striped uniforms, aren't exactly rolling tanks into sovereign nations to enforce compliance.
And that observation is exactly where the narrative in our sources makes a massive, fascinating pivot.
Okay, walk me through the pivot.
The authors argue that the Vatican realized centuries ago that traditional standing armies are expensive, highly visible, and eventually face rebellion.
True.
So the claim is that they didn't need to build a standing army. They built something far more insidious, pervasive, and unaccountable.
The intelligence agencies.
The modern global intelligence community.
Man, this was the part of the reading where I actually had to put the papers down and walk around the room.
There's a lot to process.
It is. Because the texts are not arguing that intelligence agencies occasionally collaborate with the Vatican. They are arguing that the world's intelligence agencies, the CIA, MI6, the KGB, are the secular enforcement arm of this Roman structure.
The secular enforcement arm. And the historical origins they provide for this claim are incredibly detailed.
Let's dig into that. How do they prove this?
Let's trace their logic regarding the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. Following World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was transitioned into the CIA.
Right, standard history.
Yes. But the sources heavily focus on the two founding fathers of America's modern intelligence apparatus, William Wild Bill Donovan and Allen Dulles.
Okay, so I know standard history reveres Donovan as an American patriot, a visionary who saw that the post-war world required a permanent intelligence capability.
But these sources zero in on his religious and fraternal affiliations.
What were they?
Well, they highlight that William Donovan was a devout Catholic and, crucially, a prominent Knight of Malta.
A Knight of Malta. There it is again.
Exactly. The alternate narrative alleges that Donovan wasn't chosen to architect the CIA because of his unyielding patriotism to the United States.
Why was he chosen then?
The texts claim he was selected precisely because his ultimate loyalty and obedience belonged to Rome, far outweighing his allegiance to the U.S. Constitution.
Wow.
They argue that he baked loyalty to the Vatican into the very DNA of the agency.
So the foundation itself was compromised from day one.
According to the text, yes. And it's not just Donovan and the CIA. The texts throw a massive net.
Yeah, I saw that. They claim the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, was founded by Charles Joseph Bonaparte.
Right.
And they explicitly identify him as a papal knight.
Exactly. And they look across the Atlantic to the UK and point to Sir Stuart Menzies, the legendary head of MI6.
Claiming his operations were deeply intertwined with this same network.
Yes. They even cross into supposedly hostile territory, linking the Soviet KGB to figures like Prince Anton Turkel and the notorious British double agent Kim Philby.
Philby, too.
Yes, arguing these men were all operating under the same overarching esoteric umbrella.
Okay, I have to stop you because they even fold the creation of Israel's Mossad into this web.
They do.
The sources allege that Mossad's early intelligence frameworks were heavily influenced and trained by Reinhard Gehlen.
Right, Gehlen.
And for anyone who doesn't know, Gehlen was a former Nazi intelligence chief who ran the Foreign Army's East Division for Hitler.
A literal Nazi spy master.
Yes. And after the war, according to these texts, he was protected by the Knights of Malta, absorbed into the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and utilized to shape other allied agencies, including Mossad.
It's an incredibly tangled web. Furthermore, the texts point to James Jesus Angleton,
The infamous counterintelligence chief of the CIA.
Right, highly paranoid guy. The texts note that he simultaneously managed both the Vatican desk and the Israeli desk at the agency.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on the logistics of this because this is where my brain starts to short circuit.
I get it. It's a lot.
If we look at the Gehlen connection, the texts lean heavily on something called Operation Ratlines.
Yes, the rat lines.
Now, I know from standard history that the ratlines were real smuggling routes used by fleeing Nazis. That's a documented fact.
Right.
But how do these specific authors describe the mechanics of that operation, and how does it prove their point about the Vatican building an intelligence octopus?
Well, according to the declassified documents and the historical analysis in our stack, the rat lines were not just a chaotic ad hoc escape route.
They weren't just guys sneaking through the woods.
No, they are described as a highly sophisticated, institutionally supported smuggling network established immediately after the fall of the Third Reich.
Supported by who?
The Vatican. The texts allege that the Vatican utilized its vast, globally recognized infrastructure to move these individuals.
Infrastructure like what?
We're talking about monasteries and convents being used as safe houses. We're talking about the issuance of Red Cross passports under false identities.
Which is wild.
Very. The sources specifically highlight figures like Father Krunoslav Draganovic, a Croatian Catholic priest, who allegedly orchestrated the escape of massive numbers of fascist war criminals to South America and the United States.
We're talking about some of the most horrific figures of the 20th century. Men like Klaus Barbie,
The Butcher of Lyon.
literally known as the Butcher of Lyon, and Ante Pavelic, the fascist dictator of the Ustaše in Croatia, who oversaw the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma.
Absolute monsters.
And the texts claim the Vatican actively protected these men.
They go further than just protection. The authors claim this is a strategic acquisition of assets.
Assets, you mean they wanted their skills?
Exactly. The narrative alleges that the Vatican, working in seamless coordination with British and newly formed American intelligence, integrated these seasoned Nazi and fascist intelligence officers directly into the CIA and MI6.
But how did they sell that to the public, or even internally?
Well, the publicly palatable justification, if you dig into the declassified history, was that these men possessed vital ground-level intelligence on the Soviet Union.
Ah, because they had just been fighting them.
Right, and they were fiercely anti-communist, making them indispensable assets for the impending Cold War.
But wait. This is exactly where the internal logic of the conspiracy seems to collide with massive historical realities.
I know where you're going with this.
I mean, if the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a mortal existential struggle for decades...
The Cold War.
Right. If the threat of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis was real, if proxy wars were bleeding both empires dry, How do the sources explain KGB operatives and CIA operatives secretly reporting to the same Jesuit masters in Rome?
That seems impossible.
Logistically and psychologically, how do you orchestrate a multi-decade global standoff if the top generals on both sides are playing for the same team?
I anticipated you would hit that wall because it is the most difficult pill to swallow in this entire narrative.
This just doesn't compute.
The sources address this massive contradiction by deploying a concept we touched on earlier. They claim the entire Cold War was a completely fabricated conflict,
A fabricated
a
conflict.
geopolitical hoax.
A hoax. A 40-year, trillion-dollar hoax.
Yes. They frame the Cold War as the ultimate application of the Hegelian dialectic on a planetary scale.
Okay, walk me through that. How are they defining the Hegelian dialectic in this context?
It's a process of problem, reaction, solution,
Okay.
or more formally, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right.
If you are a shadow power seeking absolute global control, you cannot simply demand that nations surrender their wealth, their military autonomy, and their civil liberties.
It's obviously not. The populations would revolt immediately.
Exactly. So instead, you manufacture a thesis, let's say Western capitalism.
Okay.
Then you fund and engineer a terrifying antithesis, Soviet communism.
And you smash them together.
You smash them against each other in a state of perpetual, terrifying tension. The public is so paralyzed by the fear of nuclear vaporization that they gladly consent to the synthesis.
And what is the synthesis in this scenario?
The creation of massive, entirely unaccountable military-industrial complexes, black budgets, and shadow intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Okay, let me make sure I'm getting this straight. So the authors are arguing that by controlling the top intelligence chiefs on both sides,
Right. The men unified under papal knighthoods.
whether they were British, American, or Soviet, the Vatican essentially played the world like a giant chessboard.
That's the claim.
So the pawns genuinely hated each other. The knights and rooks were dying in proxy wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, but the players moving the pieces were having drinks together in the dark.
Exactly. The populations were traumatized and bleeding, but the intelligence apparatus at the apex of both empires was secretly collaborating to consolidate total global control.
Immune from democratic oversight.
Immune precisely because of the very national security threats they were manufacturing.
Ah, no. Which brings us to the most difficult, the darkest, and frankly the most upsetting part of this entire deep dive.
Yeah, this is where the narrative pivots.
Because if we follow the author's logic up to this point, they have established this incredibly powerful, legally immune, deeply compartmentalized global intelligence network.
A massive logistical machine.
But then the sources pivot to ask, what is the ultimate day-to-day utility of this network?
Right, why do they need all these agencies?
Beyond geopolitical espionage, beyond staging proxy wars, why do these agencies actually exist?
And the texts make a truly harrowing claim here.
They make the claim that these intelligence agencies serve as the logistical supply chain for a systemic elite child trafficking network.
The narrative shifts completely from political domination to the procurement of human beings.
It's horrific.
And the authors do not frame this as a modern phenomenon. They trace the historical precedent back centuries. They argue that the logistical infrastructure for human trafficking was built long before the CIA existed.
Right. They anchor this in historical events like the 1618 home children scandal.
Yes, 1618.
According to the texts, this was a massive, systemic operation originating in England where children deemed vagrant or impoverished were rounded up by the thousands.
Just scooped off the streets.
Yeah. They were loaded onto ships and transported across the ocean to colonies in Australia, Canada, and America.
Where they were effectively used as slave labor.
And the connection the sources draw is that while this operation was carried out under the guise of state-sponsored philanthropy,
Or secular colonial expansion, right?
yeah, they claim it was actually a Catholic Church operation hiding behind Protestant and secular fronts like early forms of Freemasonry to maintain total deniability.
The texts argue that the church learned early on how to move human cargo across borders using institutional cover.
So they were practicing logistics centuries ago.
Exactly. And they trace this forward to the 20th century, explicitly citing incidents during World War II.
Like what?
Well, the texts mention the nuns of Notre Dame de Sion. The authors claim that around 1953, these nuns were deeply implicated in kidnapping and smuggling Jewish children out of Spain.
Nuns smuggling kids.
Yes. The narrative alleges that the Vatican strategically utilized these smuggling operations for dual purposes.
Which were?
Sometimes to intentionally stoke racial and religious tensions as a geopolitical distraction, while simultaneously quietly trafficking tens of thousands of children through their hidden monastic networks.
Which brings us back to the intelligence agencies. The primary question you have to ask when reading these claims is, why utilize an intelligence apparatus for trafficking?
It seems like overkill, right?
Yeah, why not just use regular organized crime? But the authors provide a very cold, calculated logistical answer.
An intelligence agency is the ultimate cutout.
Right. By definition, intelligence agencies are designed to conduct deniable operations.
They operate with black budgets that are not subject to congressional or parliamentary audits.
They specialize in erased paper trails, encrypted communications, clandestine movement, everything you would need for a massive trafficking ring.
But the text goes even deeper into the logistics, and this is where I want to talk about the Sovereign Military Order of Malta again.
Ah, the Knights of Malta.
Because the authors highlight a very specific mechanism of international law that makes this all possible. The Knights of Malta are a highly unique entity on the world stage.
Very unique.
They are recognized as a sovereign nation by over 100 countries.
Which is crazy to think about.
They have observer status at the United Nations. They issue their own currency, their own stamps, and most importantly, their own passports.
Yet they possess virtually zero actual physical territory.
Right. And the mechanism that the sources drill down into is the diplomatic pouch.
The diplomatic pouch.
Under the Vienna Convention and international law, a diplomatic pouch, which, by the way, can be anything from a small envelope to a massive shipping crate.
Wait, it can be a crate.
Yes, there's no size limit. And it cannot be opened, searched, seized, or even x-rayed by any border patrol, customs agency, or law enforcement entity in the world.
I really want the listener to grasp the weight of this claim. If we follow the text's logic, diplomatic immunity isn't just a polite political courtesy used to transport sensitive treaty documents between embassies.
No, it's a shield.
It is being weaponized as an impenetrable invisibility cloak. It's like the ultimate physical manifestation of the dark web.
That's a great way to put it.
The authors are alleging that the Knights of Malta, acting as the Vatican's intelligence arm, use this sovereign immunity to move people, financial assets, and blackmail material across international borders with absolute zero oversight.
None. Zero.
Local border police literally are legally prohibited from looking inside the box.
That is the precise logistical nightmare the sources are outlining. They are claiming that an infrastructure originally justified to the public for national defense and espionage,
protected by the highest levels of sovereign diplomatic immunity,
was perfectly adapted into a global human trafficking syndicate.
This historical and logistical framework leads us directly into the modern era and to the whistleblower testimonies that are included in our stack of sources.
And we need to reiterate the warning to our listener here.
Yes. The texts do not stay in the realm of abstract theory. They provide highly specific, agonizing accounts from individuals who claim to have survived this exact intelligence procurement network.
The details are going to be graphic.
Very graphic. The documents include extensive testimony from a woman named Katie Groves.
Yes, Groves.
Her transcripts detail a location she refers to as Uncle Sam's Snuff Factory, which she alleges was located in Central Texas.
Central Texas. And her account is almost impossible to read.
It is. She claims she was born into and grew up within this environment, a multi-generational child snuff ring run by an organized crime family that had direct operational links to the CIA.
Operational links to the CIA. That's the key.
Right. She describes being held in a sprawling, subterranean military-style base. And the purpose of this facility, according to her testimony, was the systematic torture and murder of children to produce black market snuff films for an exclusive clientele of wealthy elites.
She provides horrifyingly specific details. She references a specific sector of this underground facility termed Cannibal's Kitchen.
God.
In this area, she claims children, particularly children of color, were murdered and literally prepared for consumption by aristocratic buyers.
I mean, the level of depravity described is designed to shock the conscience.
It is entirely overwhelming.
But Groves claims she survived only because her family's deep ties to the criminal network made her valuable for continued experimentation and to eventually become a perpetrator herself.
Which connects directly to the psychological mechanisms detailed in another major testimony in our sources.
Kathy O'Brien.
Yes. The claims of Kathy O'Brien. O'Brien is a well-known figure in the realm of whistleblower testimonies concerning intelligence abuse.
She claims she was a victim of Project Ultra.
right? Which we know was a real documented CIA program involving illegal human experimentation.
Right, the church committee hearings proved MKUltra existed.
Exactly. But O'Brien specifically claims she was a victim of a highly classified subprogram called Project Monarch.
And the vital connection back to the core theme of our deep dive is that O'Brien explicitly claims she was controlled and manipulated by what she identifies as the Roman Catholic branch of the CIA.
The Roman Catholic branch.
Yes, she details a psychological programming technique used on her that she calls the right to remain silent.
The authors use her testimony to explain why the abuse is so horrific.
It's not just sadism for sadism's sake.
No. The text argues that the extreme sadistic trauma inflicted on these victims isn't just a byproduct of depravity. It is a calculated, weaponized security protocol.
Explain that. How does trauma create security?
Well, the sources delve heavily into the psychiatric concept of polyfragmented dissociative identity disorder.
What used to be called multiple personality disorder.
Right. When a human mind, particularly a child's mind, is subjected to trauma that exceeds its capacity to process, the mind fractures.
It breaks.
It creates amnesic barriers, partitions to isolate the trauma and allow the core personality to survive.
Okay.
The authors allege that intelligence agencies learned to intentionally induce this fracturing.
Wow. It's like taking a computer hard drive and formatting it into a dozen different encrypted partitions that cannot communicate with one another.
A perfect analogy. The abusers or handlers can then allegedly program these isolated alters to hold classified information, perform specific tasks, or endure abuse.
And crucially, because of the amnesic barriers, the victim literally cannot speak about the abuse without triggering a psychological failsafe.
They literally don't have access to the memories in their conscious state.
It is the ultimate method of securing silence in a clandestine operation.
The scale of psychological manipulation is staggering. But it also forces us to look at another whistleblower in the stack who speaks not from the perspective of a programmed victim, but as an insider.
Michael MacArthur.
Yes, Michael MacArthur. He claims to be a former Satanist who operated within these networks and came forward to provide inside information regarding the explicit complicity of federal agents.
And his testimony is notable because he names specific individuals.
He names names.
The text lists FBI agents he claims were directly involved, including men named Chucky Mike Peters, Nickel Hera, Ken Lanning, and Nick O'Hara.
And he also names a CIA agent, Cape Richardson.
Right. MacArthur alleges that these federal agents were not rogue actors operating off the clock, but that they used their official government time, agency vehicles, and federal resources to abduct children, specifically to supply satanic rituals with sacrificial victims.
Using federal resources.
Okay, I have to stop here. I really need to ground this.
I know, it's a lot to take in.
Because as I read these testimonies, I mean thousands of victims, underground military bases, elite aristocratic buyers, cannibalism, widespread federal complicity. My mind just rejects the logistics.
It sounds too massive to hide.
Exactly. I kept asking the text, what happens when reality intrudes? You cannot move thousands of kids, run massive underground facilities, and stage elite snuff films without leaving a massive footprint.
Someone is going to see something.
Right. What happens when a local sheriff or an honest city detective or a diligent state investigator stumbles upon the trail? Someone has to notice the missing kids or find a financial anomaly. How do the authors rationalize the absolute lack of mass arrests and public exposure?
That is the most critical logistical hurdle in the narrative, and the sources provide a very uniform institutional answer.
Which is?
The impenetrable shield of national security.
National security.
Yes. The texts assert that whenever local law enforcement or independent investigators begin to connect the dots and close in on these networks, the federal apparatus immediately intervenes.
Because they're monitoring the local cops.
Because the perpetrators are allegedly intertwined with CIA operations, military intelligence, or high-level FBI task forces. So their illicit activities are legally classified as black operations, vital to national defense.
So, if a local police chief gets a warrant to raid a warehouse suspected of trafficking,
Right.
a team of federal agents in suits shows up, flashes badges, and invokes the National Security Act.
Exactly.
They tell the local cops that the warehouse is a classified CIA front company, that interfering will compromise international operations, and they order the police to stand down under threat of federal prosecution.
That is exactly the mechanism the texts describe. They claim it is an active, systemic, top-down cover-up designed to crush local jurisdiction.
And do they have examples of this?
Oh, yes. The sources point to specific, high-profile case studies to illustrate this elite cover-up in action. One of the most glaring examples they use involves Cardinal Francis Spellman.
Spellman, okay, I know Spellman from standard mid-century American history. He was the Archbishop of New York,
A very powerful man.
a titanic figure. They called him the American Pope. He had the ear of presidents, endless political capital. But these sources completely invert his legacy. What do they claim happened with him?
Well, the sources cite a document referred to as the confidential report, authored by a detective Rothstein.
Rothstein.
According to the texts, Rothstein was conducting a deep dive investigation that eventually uncovered evidence linking the CIA to commercial-grade systemic pedophilia.
And Spellman was in the report.
Yes. Within that web, Rothstein's report allegedly identified Cardinal Spellman as an archabuser, heavily protected by a network of devout Catholics embedded within government and law enforcement agencies.
And when Rothstein tried to act on it, like when he tried to actually make a move,
The text claims that when local authorities finally gathered enough momentum to issue a formal subpoena for Spellman, the system activated its defenses.
they pulled the national security card.
Yes, the National Security Act was explicitly invoked, jurisdiction was usurped, and the subpoena was immediately withdrawn. The investigation was basically vaporized.
Wow. It's like a legal Faraday cage.
That's a good way to describe it.
A massive moat of bureaucracy, corrupted officials, and classified designations designed specifically to protect the castle, in this case, the Vatican hierarchy, and its key operatives from any external legal consequences. The evidence just hits the shield and dissipates.
The moat is incredibly deep, and it is guarded by the very institutions we rely on for justice. The texts provide another chilling example of this impunity with the case of Emanuela Orlandi.
The 15-year-old girl who vanished in 1983.
Yes.
This is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in Italian history, largely because she was the daughter of a Vatican employee and actually lived inside the Vatican walls.
Right, highly secure area.
So how do our sources contextualize her disappearance?
Well, the texts discard the standard theories of random abduction or mafia involvement.
Instead,
They cite claims made by a leading exorcist priest who asserted that Emanuela was actively kidnapped by the Vatican police themselves.
kidnapped by the inside security.
Yes. The allegation is that she was procured internally to serve as a victim for satanic sex parties involving foreign diplomats, high-ranking clergy, and intelligence figures right inside the Vatican.
God.
The authors use this to demonstrate that the procurement network operates with such absolute impunity that it can consume the children of its own employees without consequence.
And the complicity of the elite circles doesn't stop at the Vatican walls. The sources bring up Jimmy Savile.
Ah, yes, Jimmy Savile.
For our listeners unfamiliar, Jimmy Savile was one of the most famous television and radio personalities in the UK. But after his death, a floodgate opened, and he was revealed to be perhaps the most prolific, predatory sex offender in British history.
With hundreds of victims spanning decades.
Right. He had access to hospitals, schools, and the highest levels of British royalty. Why do the authors include him in a text about the Vatican?
Because of one very specific, highly visible detail. Jimmy Savile was awarded a papal knighthood, a commander of the Order of St. Gregory the Great, by Pope John Paul II.
I struggled with that detail when I was reading. What is the author's takeaway from that? I mean, maybe they just didn't know.
The authors argue from a standpoint of intelligence and security. They claim that to receive an honor of that magnitude, an individual undergoes intense vetting by Vatican security services.
Okay.
Therefore, they conclude there are only two possibilities. Either the Vatican's intelligence apparatus was completely incompetent and missed decades of horrific open secret abuse. Or, far more sinisterly, they knew exactly what he was. The texts argue that he was rewarded precisely because his procurement activities and his ability to compromise high-level British society were immensely useful to the network.
Man, it changes the entire paradigm.
It does.
The authors are suggesting that the abuse is not a tragic bug in the system, a failure of oversight. The abuse is a feature.
A core feature.
It is the currency of the realm, which leads directly into the incredibly aggressive claims made by Kevin Annett and his organization, the ITCCS.
The International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State.
Right.
Kevin Annett's work forms a substantial pillar of the modern claims in our stack. His tribunal focuses heavily on exposing what they call the Ninth Circle cult.
The Ninth Circle.
According to these texts, this is an elite satanic cult allegedly commanded by the current pope. They specify Pope Leo IV and deeply involves global royalty, explicitly naming King Charles.
And the logistical details Annette's tribunal provides are incredibly specific, which makes them sound both terrifying and, honestly, difficult to believe.
They are very granular.
For instance, they highlight a Pacific trafficking network allegedly overseen by a Catholic bishop named Brian Mascort in Australia.
Yes, the texts claim this specific network traffics children from Australia to major port cities like Shanghai, Vancouver, and Seattle.
And the mechanism they allege is that the victims are smuggled inside the false hulls of massive commercial shipping vessels.
The false hulls of ships.
See, this is another point where I have to pause and express my skepticism based purely on logistics.
The ports.
Right. Smuggling thousands of children in the false hulls of commercial ships across the Pacific. Have you seen a modern port?
It's massive.
You have unionized dock workers, massive crane operators, international customs agents, sniffer dogs, Coast Guard inspections. The sheer number of blue-collar workers and bureaucrats required to stay perfectly silent about a massive human trafficking operation running through major global ports seems impossible.
It's a huge undertaking.
How do the authors rationalize that level of silence?
It's a completely valid logistical challenge. The authors rationalize it by pointing back to the compartmentalization of intelligence agencies and the corruption of key nodes.
Key nodes. Not everyone.
Exactly. They argue you don't need every dock worker to be in on the conspiracy.
You just need the bosses.
Right. You only need to control the Port Authority director who assigns which ships get inspected, the customs chief who signs off on the manifests, and the local police commander who ignores the missing persons reports near the docks. If the intelligence agencies, the Knights of Malta, control the top nodes, the rest of the massive bureaucratic machine just blindly processes the paperwork.
They don't even know what they're rubber stamping.
Exactly.
Well,
Furthermore, while these specific claims of the ITCCS are extreme and heavily contested, the authors anchor their broader argument in documented, undeniable international friction regarding the Vatican's handling of abuse.
you're referring to the United Nations conflict.
Yes. The sources extensively detail how in 2014, the United Nations took an unprecedented step.
They formally condemned them.
The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child explicitly and publicly castigated the Holy See. The UN accused the Vatican of systematically placing the preservation of the Church's reputation and power above the protection of children.
And they refused to hand over documents, right?
Crucially, yes.
Wow.
The UN highlighted the Vatican's steadfast refusal to hand over internal dossiers on clerical abusers to civil law enforcement.
So for the authors of our texts, this isn't just an institutional failure.
No, it is proof of a sovereign entity actively protecting its procurement network from international law.
If we pull all these threads together, the intelligence agencies, the unsearchable diplomatic pouches, the psychological programming, the elite cover-ups, the point about the abuse being a feature of the system becomes terrifyingly clear.
It's functional.
The texts are arguing that this vast trafficking network isn't just about satisfying depravity, it's about geopolitical control.
It is the ultimate control mechanism. By procuring victims for the global elite presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, royalty, media moguls, the network gathers undeniable catastrophic blackmail material.
It creates a system of mutually assured destruction at the highest levels of global society.
Epstein on a global multi-century scale.
Exactly. If every single person in the room at the G20 summit or the World Economic Forum is compromised, if they all know that the intelligence agencies hold the tapes,
No one can step out of line.
no one can challenge the agenda. It ensures absolute, unbreakable obedience to Rome.
And that leads us to the final zooming question of this entire deep dive.
The why.
Yes. If we accept the monumental premise that this network exists, we have to ask, to what end? Why expend the energy to maintain a multi-generational, incredibly dangerous, resource-intensive devil's simulation? What is the end game?
According to the sources, the ultimate goal is twofold. First, they claim the primary objective is the total destruction of the Protestant Reformation and the annihilation of the concepts of true political and religious freedom that arose from it.
They view independent thought as the greatest threat to their Babylonian model.
And second, the ultimate objective is the installation of what the texts repeatedly call the New World Order.
And we must define what these specific authors mean by a New World Order. They are not describing a benign, unified utopia.
Definitely not.
The texts describe a fascist, socialist, communist, global police state, a world completely stripped of national sovereignty, where borders are dissolved, and the entire human population is ruled universally by a papal Caesar.
And they allege this ruler will ultimately sit in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. It is a vision of total, inescapable tyranny. And the sources claim that the system is so ruthless that anyone who recognizes the agenda and attempts to dismantle it is immediately eliminated, regardless of their status.
Which is how they explain JFK.
Right. They bring the assassination of John F. Kennedy directly into this framework.
JFK is a fascinating inclusion. John F. Kennedy was famously the first Catholic president of the United States. He was a Knight of Columbus.
So on paper, he should have been the ultimate ally to this alleged Catholic power structure.
But the texts allege he realized the true nature of the intelligence apparatus he had inherited.
They point to his famous desire to, quote, splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
Right after the Bay of Pigs disaster.
The authors argue that JFK realized the CIA was not serving American interests, but was acting as the rogue enforcement arm of this Vatican network. He threatened the primary mechanism of the devil's simulation.
So, according to the text, the network ordered his assassination in broad daylight to send a message to every subsequent world leader.
Cross us, and you die.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to maintain this level of control over decades, the texts argue that the population must be kept weak, distracted, and dependent.
Right.
The authors claim that the American people and populations worldwide are being subjected to a slow, systemic degradation.
They look at the international drug trade.
The heroin epidemics, the crack cocaine crisis, the modern fentanyl scourge, and they argue this is not just organized crime.
They claim it is a deliberate chemical warfare operation run jointly by the CIA and the mafia.
To numb the working class, destroy communities, and fund black operations.
And the endless cycles of foreign wars. The conflicts in the Middle East, the proxy wars.
Also entirely engineered.
Just meat grinders.
The texts claim these wars serve a dual purpose. They act as massive money laundering operations for the military-industrial complex. But more importantly, they serve to traumatize the domestic population.
Because the terrified population begs for security.
Right. They willingly accept mass surveillance, the militarization of local police, and the erosion of civil liberties.
Slowly prepping the citizenry to accept the draconian, centralized controls of the New World Order.
I have to admit, reading through the conclusion of these texts left me with a profound sense of vertigo.
I know exactly what you mean. If the system is as omnipotent as these sources claim, if they truly control the media, the international banking system, the courts, the intelligence agencies, the global drug supply, and the political elite through blackmail, what exactly do the authors expect the reader to do?
It paints a picture of absolute hopelessness.
It feels completely insurmountable.
It is incredibly bleak. However, despite the overwhelming darkness of the narrative, the sources repeatedly emphasize human agency.
They don't just say give up.
No, they refuse to concede total defeat, to use a military axiom. The enemy gets a vote.
The enemy gets a vote.
The texts explicitly state, the enemy of the devil's simulation is you.
By you, they mean the informed individual listening right now.
Yes. The author's entire project, exposing the Babylonian roots of the Vatican, detailing the creation of the intelligence cutouts, explaining the psychological programming, and the blackmail networks, is an attempt to break the spell of compliance.
They operate on the belief that a system built entirely on secrecy, deception, and public ignorance simply cannot survive mass awareness.
Right. By showing the reader the invisible map, they hope to neutralize the simulation's power.
Let's take a deep breath and try to summarize the staggering, exhausting journey we've just taken through this stack of alternate history.
It's been a marathon.
We started by exploring the fundamental claim that the Roman Catholic Church is a Babylonian front, a parasitic shell hiding the militant operational command of the Jesuits.
Who utilized the diplomatic and financial power of the Knights of Malta and Freemasonry.
Right. And from there, we mapped out the allegation that this Vatican entity engineered the modern global intelligence apparatus.
They purportedly used the rat lines to absorb Nazi war criminals into the CIA and MI6.
And then fabricated the Cold War as a Hegelian dialectic to build unaccountable military empires on both sides of the globe.
And then we waded into the darkest claims in the material.
Yeah, that these intelligence agencies, utilizing the absolute legal immunity of diplomatic pouches and sovereign military order of Malta passports, act as a deniable logistics network for global child trafficking.
We explored the horrifying whistleblower testimonies of people like Katie Groves and Michael MacArthur.
Detailing psychological programming, DD, and elite government-run abuse facilities.
And finally, we examined how national security protocols are allegedly weaponized to crush any local law enforcement investigations.
Securing a sprawling system of elite blackmail designed to usher in a global, totalitarian New World Order.
It is a massive amount of information to process.
It completely invades and challenges literally every conventional narrative we hold about modern history, religion, and the nature of global power.
It forces a profound cognitive dissonance. And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
Please do.
We began by discussing how much we naturally prefer a clean, linear textbook map of history.
The comfort of a simple narrative.
Right. But the sources we analyze today suggest that the greatest, most effective defense mechanism of this alleged devil's simulation isn't keeping their operations entirely hidden in the shadows.
It's not just about secrecy.
No. Rather, it's making them so sprawling, so unimaginably dark, and so deeply embedded in our most trusted institutions that even when whistleblowers do step forward, the public simply refuses to look.
Because it's too muddy. It shatters too many illusions. It is simply too terrifying to accept as a possibility.
Precisely. It begs a deeply uncomfortable philosophical question that the authors leave us with.
What is it?
If the ultimate shield of this alleged network is our own psychological inability to confront the unimaginable, how much power does our own disbelief grant them?
Wow, that is a thought that is going to linger for a long, long time. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive. It has not been easy material to process, but as always, we encourage you to keep questioning the narratives you are handed, keep exploring that murky map, and stay curious.